Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings with a side of salutations, and welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Watty, and thank you for joining me as we continue today's epic adventure, as some may say. But if this is your first time tuning in, usually I have a co-host, but today they aren't able to make it, so I'll try and channel their let's say incident response nature. But what I do have is producer Jeff, and thank you, producer Jeff, for producing as always. And if this is also your first time, let me take that step back to reintroduce myself the full way. So I am Tristan Watty. I come to you from the Professional Services Division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure fashion, form, and way. And as always, I always like to hear your thoughts. So feel free to put them in chat, starting with where you're tuning in from, where you're dialing in from, where are you just kind of listening in? Or if you want a question with a little bit more oomph in it, I have one that is an interesting one. So today's question: would you rather only be able to communicate in movie quotes for a week, or have everything you say for a week automatically narrated out loud by a celebrity? I think this is an interesting one, as well as this saying by producer Jeff, where it's, I'm not Russ, but create instant response play. Yes. We'll channel those inner thoughts. But in the meantime, feel free to put your thoughts in the chat. When I think of this question, if you want to know my thoughts, depends on what celebrity. Because if this is an automatic Rolodex and you might get a random celebrity, I might want to communicate in movie quotes for a week. Right? Just think of that, because you could literally go through the whole catalog from A to Z for everything. And if it just popped into your head, I think that would be the funniest thing, opposed to having a celebrity. You might have, a celebrity with a smooth voice, or you might have more of a comedic celebrity. So the thoughts are there, right? See, can we choose? No, it's just automatic. It's just somebody pops in for a random thing, right? And it's not going to be the same person the whole day. It could be, hey, you're eating lunch and it's one celebrity, and then for dinner it's another celebrity. So thank you for joining in, Spider. So if we have to think about that, as Eric says, communicated movie quotes would be so fun. Yeah, you could just pick a genre, right? So feel free to keep on thinking about that. But speaking of automatic and kind of some boundaries, not to jump into it, you might have noticed it, "You Shall Not Pass" is the title, and we'll get into that. But where we came from last week was it's time to deploy the DLP sequel arc, right? Where we talked about, hey, how do we manage DLP within an enterprise environment? How do we create something that's scalable? And we came to the conclusion of some automation using some step functions, things of that nature, right? So I think it would be interesting if we take another step beyond that, right? Because when you think of data protection, you think of data exfiltration. And one of the things that this episode helps to prepare you for is also the funny celebrities that Spider you named, Jose you named. Thank you for those pieces. All right. But I think permission boundaries is an interesting concept, because if you're thinking about, hey, how do I protect my environment? Well, what are the boundaries of your environment? How did you get to that? How do you kind of break that down? Well, lucky for you, we're going to break that down today for a little bit, because permission boundaries, the identity-based and SCPs, right? This is all part of the intersection model. And what I mean by that is, how are you implementing the defense in depth within your environment, right? How do you evaluate policies so that you know where your gatekeeper is? What I mean by the gatekeeper is the famous movie quote, "You shall not pass." Kind of see what we did there to bring it full circle around, right? It essentially, do you have that gatekeeper to decide who shall or shall not pass within the scope of your environment. Right? See, Ari gets it. He wants to communicate only in Lord of the Rings quotes. And I think permission boundaries sets you up for that, right? Because what we're trying to do is prevent privilege escalation overarchingly, right? We want to close the gaps within our IAM architecture, because by closing said gaps will help to strengthen not only your security posture, but it'll help to shape your environment in such a way that you're moving towards that maturity that everybody thinks you have, right? Is what part of the cycle are you in? Are you within the crawl, the walk, or the run phase within your environment when it comes to maturity? And these are the steps that help you take that step towards the run. Eventually, we want to get to fly, but I think that's a different episode, different title, different superhero power. But essentially, what you want to do is you want to first figure out what are the common privilege escalation vectors. Right? How do you prevent, let's say, a rogue role creation? Right? There's a lot of R's in there, but what you're trying to do is understand, hey, if somebody creates a role within the environment, okay, that's one possible vector. Or if somebody, let's say, manipulates a trust policy, that's another vector. And you kind of see how it can kind of vary within your environment depending on how you're looking at it. How do you create something that catches all these different aspects? Well, spoilers, it's layer controls, but what you're doing is you're designing for the future. Just overarchingly, what we're trying to get to. And the spider would fly be a world of scale, like 1 million recs per second. I think fly, if we were to take that in the context of crawl, walk, run, and then you're flying, I think it depends on, one, your target state security strategy, but two, it depends on what your organization thinks flying would be. Would it be something automation at scale, where everything within the environment is automated and you have human approval gates? Or are you leaning towards more agentic AI and having certain agents do certain pieces of the environment, again, with those human checks in place? I think that's where you get to thinking about from a fly perspective, because if run is the step before that, run, you kind of have your IR plan mapped out. You have your cycle of how to improve. You have stuff like just-in-time access, right? Can you assign access for a given amount of time to an individual that goes through an approval workflow? And it helps to shape how users think of access within the environment, because they only need access to specific pieces of the environment at a given point, right? So one of the mindsets that we see with customers is usually if they're an administrator, they might have just power user access. And that power user access gives them a lot of access they may not need. And then you say, okay, what are the other compensating controls or defense layers to prevent somebody with a power user access from doing something within their environment that might not be so well received, let's say? Well, that's when you start to think about, okay, service control policies. Or, wait, how do we put more into place? Well, that's where we get to the reality of something like permission boundaries, especially across multiple accounts. How do you scale something that goes from theory to production? That's usually the workflow that everybody's trying to kind of figure out. Is we have a theory on how to protect our environment. We have a theory of how to deploy it. But when it comes to enforcing and implementation, that theory starts to fall apart a little bit. So when you look at something like, let's take a step back for SCPs, right? Service control policy. You have policies defined within your infrastructure in a certain manner, fashion, form. Well, how are you governing that? How are you enforcing that? Because that's kind of the first step. For example, if you have services, you have 200 plus AWS services, and you want to limit to only 100 within the environment until it goes through your checks and balances, your compliance controls, things of that nature. Okay, there's a broad cut. You say These are the allowed services. Everything else is blocked until we allow it. Okay, great. Well, what's the next step beyond that? What is your baseline SCP kind of thoughts? Well, the baseline SCP should be based off a framework. And that's where we get into well-architected, the security reference architecture. We start to get into a lot of conversation. But the main conversational piece is, can you enforce this baseline within your environment? And that's where we start to think about that run and fly conversation. Because if the baseline is everything must be encrypted, otherwise it's not deployed or allowed within the environment, how do you do that? And that's where we start to get to the conversation of, all right, what is our biggest concern with automation? Well, to every company, to every organization, it might be a little bit different. And as Ari pointed out, where does least privilege come into play? Exactly that. That's the conversation that we need to have at a higher level is, okay, what is least privilege to my organization? What are the mechanisms I have in place to establish least privilege? And I think it's important to kind of do some of those, let's say, spoilers where we jump into some of the knowledge quest items, right? Because we're having some fun here. And part of that conversation comes to, all right, do we understand what identity is? What is I am? How do we understand identities? How do we handle identities? Because what we see when we have conversations with customers is, okay, we have AWS Identity Center. Okay, great. But we may have, let's say, something else defined or security groups or something like that within, let's say, Entra ID. And then we want to take those security groups from Entra ID, and then we want to sync in, and we want it to be the same within AWS. Okay, but when you do so, are you mapping permission sets the same way? Are you thinking about permission the same way? Because two different ecosystems, two different thought pieces. And one of the things that we see when we have conversations is the tech debt that may come from just moving or synchronizing those permissions. Because sometimes what happens is it's synchronized from the earliest pattern of the organization. So it could have just been security groups and roles and things of that nature that synced up from the on-prem environment over into Entra ID. And it's like, okay, this is what we have. And now we're syncing it across to AWS. So it's years of tech debt that built up. Now you're saying, okay, how do we unravel this a bit? Right? And Ari, yes, no, 10 billion points to you for at least privilege. And Spider, like the great DevOps idea states, I AWS, therefore I am. Thank you for that. And I think this is the question when we start to think about these identities and how we're thinking about it is, hey, why I should use I am? Because as Spider says, therefore I am. Right? Well, part of it is the granular permission structure. That's one of the pieces of the puzzle. But you have to think about it from the overall boundaries piece. And what I mean by that is if we take that step back, no, further back, right? What we're trying to get to is understanding what is a permission boundary. Well, we define a permission boundary as, let's say, a ceiling on what an IAM principal is allowed to do. It so that, let's say, one thing never opens, let's say, everything within your environment. You don't want a skeleton key, essentially. So what you're trying to do is set that ceiling. So you're giving your developers freedom, but you're also establishing some guardrails, some boundaries, right? See what I did there with the name, that have them hit this wall and they're not able to go any further. And that's for one, protection of the organization, but two, so that you get to that point of least privilege, right? And there are some, let's say, misconceptions when it comes to attaching a permission boundary. Because one of those, let's say, misunderstandings is that AWS IAM is believing that attaching, let's say, a permission boundary gives a user a role, access to the different services listed in that boundary. When in reality, what it's doing is the principal has zero effective permissions until identity-based policy is applied, or explicitly granted, I should say. These are all important parts of the puzzle, because when we're looking at it, we go back to that conversational point of, right, why should I use? When do I use? How do I use? And this is all pieces of the puzzle that we're trying to piece together, because it's all really an equation. It starts as a small equation, but kind of builds over time. And that permission equation essentially comes from, okay, how does AWS evaluate the overlap between identity-based policies and permission boundaries to determine the effective permissions? And there are great graphs and things of that nature in order to kind of map everything out. But essentially what you're trying to understand is, one, do I understand how identity works just from a normal user role standpoint? And do I understand kind of, okay, how do I compare identities, right? What is kind of the overlap? And this is where we get into this view. If we hit the good old enhance, right, into this a little bit, you start to see it a little bit better, right? So we have the root user that goes to the IAM user, the role, the entity, right? Identity, IAM group, and then you go to the policy instance. This is an important part of the puzzle to consider and to work out, because what you're trying to do is understand the fundamentals. And once you understand the fundamentals, you can start to apply things so that, hey, any permission granted by one but absent from another is dropped. It's never denied explicitly, but it just never goes into effect. And yes, enhance. Enhance. I want to get that hat that just says enhance, right? But I digress, because what we're trying to get to as well is just also understanding the policy logic. This is why I'm taking so much time on this particular item, because what we're trying to do is understand, how do we walk all the way up from, hey, this is a root user, which we shouldn't be using, and then kind of divvy that up into IAM user, IAM role, and go from there. IAM user, another thing you shouldn't be using. Sorry, I kind of have the Bane voice going. But what we're trying to get to is understanding the logical step by step, so we can understand how permission boundaries are leveled within our layered policy model, right? Because if we think of it from the perspective of, okay, SCPs are the outermost guardrail for the entire account. Permission boundaries set the guardrail from an individual principal within that account, right? So if we start to go down that route, that means before something can pass, and I have to zoom in for this, before something can pass, because you shall not pass, you must request the access before that gate, right? So you can only narrow what's allowed, never expand it. And I think that's an important concept to kind of to soak in, to take in, right? Because if you have the outer shell with your SCP, and then your principal or permission boundary says, hey, okay, this is the ceiling for an individual principal. Now you start to see how you can start to cut that down a little bit more. So it's an important part of the puzzle that you're trying to kind of take step by step. So I know part of the conversation then goes to, okay, if I have my IAM set up, my identity set up, when do I use permission boundaries? That is a good question. 10 billion points to you if you're thinking that. Permission boundaries, let's say, shine the brightest in a delegation scenario. So let's say if you need developers or platform teams, or let's say automated pipelines to create IAM roles and policies, that's kind of where you start to see it to shine, because they can never exceed the privilege ceiling that you're defined. So if you have something, let's say like a landing zone accelerator, Now, if you have permission boundaries, you can set the boundaries. So while you're vending out accounts or identities, you're not exceeding that ceiling, which could be an issue, right? If you didn't have that boundary in place. Because what you're trying to avoid is, one, something getting vended that exceeds the amount of privilege that you wanted it to, right? And then two, making sure that somebody within the organization can't go outside of that process, that outermost shell, think of the service control policies, right? Because it's all defense in depth approach. So it's all pieces of the puzzle that you're trying to account for, that you're trying to bring up, right? So as you continue on, what you need to do is identify the different scenarios and also say, good morning. So the scenarios make permission boundaries easier to understand within the context of your organization. So if permission boundaries cannot protect against, let's say, resource-based policy bypasses, well, what do you need to implement, right? If they cannot be applied to service link roles, what do you need to apply? If they cannot detect or, let's say, remediate drift on their own, then you must be in the position that you have to apply other pieces of the puzzle we were discussing, either SCPs or monitoring or config rules or just process and procedures within your security framework. It's all part of it, as well as taking a sip. Because if you were to take away one thing from our conversation today, is how do we first understand privilege escalation in AWS, and how do we protect against it? Because sometimes it's often, let's say, the misconception, and it's like, oh, this was, let's say, breached for a certain reason. Well, I think it's a series of little things, a series of, let's say, holes in the different pieces of your defense in depth strategy. Do you have the outermost shell? Do you have the monitoring? Do you have the config, the remediation, all these different pieces of the puzzle? And permission boundaries is another step on top of that. Right? Because privilege escalation isn't about kernel exploits or buffer overflows or something like that. It's just legitimately granted IAM permissions to something that manipulates the identity layer and allows somebody to modify or assume roles and policies that they shouldn't, right? And you can see how that can happen, right? I'll take you down this scenario, right? The common escalation vector is creating a new role and attaching permission policies because somebody said, hey, attach those policies that seem similar to the other ones that you have. Well, what does that policy entail, and who originally had that, who created it? All these questions start to pop into your head. And that little piece of information is very important because one of the most dangerous escalation paths is, let's say, somebody exploiting IAM's own API surface. That means a developer can create a role that goes to administrative access, right? It supersedes their current. And you may ask how they do that. Well, if you have something like pass role, well, you're essentially allowing that developer to create something that can pass its role over to a service to launch something with the permissions they need. So if you're thinking from an automation standpoint, this is why you want to go through and understand what the different pieces of the puzzle are. Because if you allow something to pass role to a service to create something for automation's sake, then it could create something that, let's say, goes above what you intended it for. And that's why permission boundaries are essential to help, let's say, neutralize some of those escalation paths that we're thinking of, right? Because when you start to go down that path, you start to think of, all right, I have my identity policy. Let's take a look. And if you're following along, feel free to go to the identity page and documentation. And it lays out the different types of policies that you can have within your environment. So if we take a look and kind of skip over to, let's say, the topic of the day with permission boundaries, you kind of see how it's laid out. It uses managed policies as a permission boundary for IAM entities. Okay, great. So if we have the understanding that we don't want developers in our scenario to be able to grant access that they shouldn't have, then we want to make sure that we prevent it. So permission boundaries, as we're laying out, helps to do so. And this is why the, let's say, traditional IAM policies alone aren't sufficient. When we're thinking about that crawl, walk, run, and then eventually fly stage, identity policies, they control which API actions a principal can call, let's say. But they have no native mechanism to restrict the content of that policy, right? So this is something that you want to understand and kind of take into account for. And as a question from Lad, would those permission boundaries need revisions over time, or is it a one-time put in place forever thing? Well, this is an interesting thing. I would say you're constantly revising your policies overall, because your organization is going to change. It's going to scale, right? You put into place, let's say, minimum, let's say, baseline standards from a security perspective. But those permission boundaries, they should be evaluated on an ongoing basis. So you could put something that's well fitted for your organization today, but it's something that should be evaluated over time. So thank you for that question. And this is a part of the equation. And I think the interesting component of this is trying to figure out, hey, if we have permission boundaries, okay, why will we implement other things? And it's exactly what we were just speaking about. And if I take another question, where would the boundary be put into architecture? Like, would the boundary come before or after, or maybe part of WAF? Does that question make sense? I know just enough to be to know nothing. I think it's a valid question of where would you put this? So from the WAF perspective, that's more of network infrastructure and kind of think of like the traffic, ones and zeros, the ins and outs. And then the permission boundaries, more from an identity perspective, right? If I am a role, what can I do within the organization? If I am a service, what can I do? And that's kind of where you start to go down the route of, okay, we understand this piece of the puzzle, right? So, and Lewis, AWS permission boundaries, how do they differ from IAM policies? So this is the interesting thing right here. So I actually have this page right up. So identity policies, attached inline policies, they grant permissions to identity. And this is one of the things we touched upon earlier. Versus permission boundaries, they define that ceiling for that identity or that principle, right? So they can't exceed that piece. So thank you for all the great questions. I love them. Just keep coming in, right? So where we want to do this is helping your organization to define said policies so that you can enforce, right? So all parts of the puzzle. And Lewis, how do permission boundaries help enforce the principle of least privilege? And that is exactly that. They're providing that ceiling that you can't exceed. So least privilege, so somebody can't, let's say, grant themselves permissions to do something that they do not have access to. But knowing that you don't know, but taking action is a good answer, proves that you're on your way to the best next step. Exactly that. Because knowing, it's half the battle, but the other half is just being interested in learning about it, right? And that's the great thing about technology and security, which I have to zoom out for, because if you don't know, it's all about building up one XP point. I always say this at the end of every episode, but I think it's an important part to call out now. It's all about building one XP point. You read one sentence, you just see a little counter go up by one. Eventually, you'll level up yourself and everyone around you because we're sharing information. And always feel free to share information in chat. So if we were to go back to, hey, how do we enforce these? Well, we can use IAM permission boundary, let's say condition key on an IAM creation action. And by using that, we're essentially setting that ceiling piece so that we can ensure that somebody cannot exceed that defined ceiling. So if you have scenario one with developer, they want to do great things. They want to accelerate fast. Okay. They want to create a role if I am administrator access granted. Okay. How do I block that? Well, if we think through and walk through the developer's actions, hey, they want to move fast. Well, parts of it is if they put into place the most permissive policy AWS role they can create, then yeah, they can move fast, but are they moving securely? It's usually a joint conversation, right? We want to make sure that, hey, permission boundary will, let's say, silently reduce. It's the guiding hand of governance and security so that these effective permissions allow, let's say, somebody not to establish administrative access, right, without having that piece defined. So when you start to go into that, that's exactly where we're going with that question, right? What are the permission boundaries? It's exactly that. Let's say we have a developer that wants to move fast. Permission boundaries, so they don't enable administrative access to themselves. Because these are all pieces of the puzzle, and parts of that puzzle come from, let's say, specific pieces of knowledge or just in general legends that they heard on ways to accelerate. And this is where we jump into our favorite section of the show, where we speak about some side quests. Because as side quest legend has it, as we cue up our great epic music, I think we'll go with this one. So, with the music on, there's one thing that is missing, and that is our visualization, our side quest board. So let's jump into that. So we have our side quest board, and if this is your first time joining in, welcome. So this side quest essentially is structured where we walk through a customer scenario and story that's based on what we discussed today. And for our customer story, let's say we're dealing with a healthcare system. Meridian Health Bridge, let's say. I think that's enough of a made-up name, so we will continue. Meridian Health Bridge. So let's say they thought they have locked down the perimeter after navigating and migrating to AWS. It's been 16 months, but they accomplished a lot. They implemented centralized logging. They have 96 client products within their environment. And they also have, let's say, some managed services. They also have a couple of SCPs in place to prevent people from disabling CloudTrail and GuardDuty and Security Hub. And it may seem that they have everything figured out, but the question comes is, how do they scale up with the potential threat landscape that nobody within their organization may have predicted? And that is the question, because as they continue to grow, will the same lessons grow with them? That's where I take the dramatic pause and say that they need to make some modifications. They need to think about stuff, because what happens if their team has, let's say, EK clusters that may be spinning up 5,000 containers, right? Well, are they ready to deal with that? Now that they have some managed services, now that they have some SCPs, this is the question where they need to ask themselves of, is their identity model enough to scale with their organization? And that is the interesting piece, because how do I know when my IAM delegation model has hit the breaking point? Well, let's go through some of the scenarios. If we are looking at our customer environment and we have the normal pieces of the puzzle, here is, okay, I have my authenticated user, my unauthenticated user. I want the path of least resistance for my authenticated user. But do we have mechanisms in place? Well, do I know what the breaking point is? And feel free to put in chat what your thoughts are. What is usually your IAM delegation model's breaking point? Or what causes you to think and reevaluate. Well, if they acquired a company and inherited over 800 IAM roles with no documentation and no boundaries, that might be a breaking point. If they have CI/CD, let's say pipelines that are using passing roles, pieces, that might be a breaking point. If they have developers that started to share credentials, or let's say broadly, that could be a breaking point. So that's when the challenge starts. Because if you are a new security person, you might start to look in some of the logging mechanisms and say, hey, something is off within our environment. Something is calling. And we have the tools, right? Because this is a mature environment. So we might have something like guard duty turned on. Hopefully we have something like guard duty turned on within the environment. So this is the different pieces. And I think this asks, how do permission boundaries interact with IAM rules and users? Well, IAM is the identity factor that we were speaking about earlier. And can AWS permission boundaries prevent a user from escalating their privileges? Yes, they can. Because you set that IAM permission boundary, and you can set the ceiling for that identity. So thank you for that. As well as Spider, the best part is how much you can accomplish today. Low exploration costs. Exactly. Right? Like watching Safe Room feature security side quests. Great way to explore. Shameless plug. But as we continue on our story, we focus. So we have a delegation crisis. With all those different items, we acquired another organization or another company, let's say. Now with that acquisition, they have so many roles. What do those roles do? How do we integrate them together? Well, we have things that trigger, let's say, guard duty. But I think the important piece of the puzzle is kind of taking a step back and thinking about what is our current identity structure? How do we handle that within the environment? Right? Because if something were to happen today, do we have the different pieces in place to say, okay, if this is the path to my AWS account, and usually user logs in and then they granted access, and how do I know that this role is a piece of the puzzle? What do I mean by that? Well, how do I know this role is actually needed with my organization in its current form and shape? Because if we acquired 800 roles, well, you might have a conversation because are those roles overlapping? I think that's the important part. And this is the piece that usually auditors would ask you the questions of, hey, if you're moving in a healthcare space, we have the HIPAA and high trust. Do you have systematic processes and procedures to prevent privilege escalation? Well, I think that's one of the questions, and I pose this to chat. When do you have that we need permission boundaries yesterday moment? Well, it's usually when the auditor asks you that type of question, right? So that's the idea, right? Overlapping roles are real. Not everything can be isolated, because if you have two roles doing the same thing, but one grants more access and no documentation, how do you know which one does which without going deep down? And will everybody in your organization know? Are there automated workflows? Well, these are all pieces of the puzzle because they could grant administrative access. And the solution starts to boil down to, do we have understanding how to delegate at scale? Do we have the understanding of the anatomy of using something like a permission boundary? Because defining permission boundaries as a cap on the maximum allowable permission helps to prevent or kind of mitigate, let's say, the direct grant of access. And that's where we get into that intersection model between identity and permission boundaries. So if we were to take that step back within our equation, say we have our organization mapped out just like this. Things not shown on screen are, let's say, SCPs, the permission boundaries, identity policies, resource-based policies, session policies. All these are different things that may help you. And we have some more questions. What are the limitations in AWS compared to service control policies? Well, if you think of service control policies at the outer shell, permission boundaries are the inside that prevent that identity escalation. And Spider, would AWS be able to help understand the roles? Yes, different pieces of, let's say, the generative AI. We could have Kiro, let's say, and we're taking a look. And if we have that within our organization and we're able to say, hey, can you tell me the different roles within it? Yes, that's going to grant it and it's going to help fast. But what it doesn't solve is the people aspect of this. Because the people aspect and how users access the environment is all part of, let's say, your workflows overarchingly. So if you were to take away said privilege from a user, what is the access they actually need? And this is where conversation and roles and how we close the gaps come into effect. And that's why we design first sandbox model, and then you start to go from there because we have different environments, different levels, all those great things. But I think this is the part where we really need to hit, let's say, the pause game button, right? The Zach Morris timeout, as I call it, because this is an important concept I think we need to take that step back out into or from. Because designing delegation is a very important part of the puzzle. Whether you're using identity-based policies, permission boundaries, everything in between, is how is your design structured? Is your design based on modern cloud organizational structures? As I mentioned in the scenario before, if you are migrated from on-prem and you kind of continue on with that same notion, is it optimized for how boundaries are supposed to be established within today's environments? And usually what we have conversations about is sometimes centralized IAM teams become the bottlenecks to organizational scaling. Because when every IAM role, every policy change, every permission request must go through a single security team, then that team inevitably transforms from strategic security function into a ticket queue, right? Processing hundreds of requests per week to say, grant this person this, grant this person that. And then they have to wait. So that's where you start to have the tension come into play between developer velocity and security governance. And what we're trying to establish is, how we want to go about that. And how do we deal with this, right? I think that's the important part. So all organizations face this fundamental friction where developers need to move fast and create execution roles, but want to keep security the top priority. And permission boundaries is a part of the answer to this equation because it enables that trust but verify model within your IAM delegation. Because with a permission boundary, it resolves that velocity versus governance conversation. Because you're letting security teams define an unbreakable ceiling once, and then trusting the developers to operate beneath that ceiling. And of course, we have other mechanisms in there, but you start to understand these different pieces of the puzzle. And what it does is allows developers that freedom to create their IAM roles and policies within that defined isolation. So if you have this somewhat of a sandbox model, it gives the developers that full autonomy to create and modify and do things within that boundary that you specified. And I think that's a very important part of the puzzle. And testing is one part of that as well, right? The other part, as Spider calls out, is the people aspect. The greatest threat to any system since bad actors. Godzilla or off by one. Yeah, I would say it's the people aspect and the workflows. And that's why you want to make sure that it's like, hey, I define this sandbox. And This is the ceiling that you can hit, right? But you're giving the freedom for them to explore, which helps them with their velocity. Right? It's all part of the puzzle, because not every team also needs the same permission ceiling. So if you have a data pipeline team with different services, they may need more of your front end, let's say, items than your back end team, for whatever example. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is you're defining these different pieces of the puzzle, but you're also reinforcing what you have in place, the structures you have in place, the guardrails. So if you can leverage something like IAM permission boundaries, that's great. Because what you're trying to avoid is kind of that, I like to say kind of more of that, okay, what is going to happen now? You never know, because it can quickly turn into the sad type of music, right? Where it's caution. Wait, what did they enable? What did they do? That's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to put the timeout to that. We're trying to quiet that a little bit, because what overarchingly we're trying to do is make sure that we have something to prevent somebody granting that administrative access. And I keep saying it 3 times for the people on the other side of the internet, because it's a layered discussion. And you have to reinforce all these different pieces. Because if somebody has the ability to remove your permission boundary, well, that's where you should have something like SCPs and be able to have those items defined in your defense in depth strategy. Because part of this understanding is building off, hey, what are the known patterns that other organizations use today? You don't have to build this from scratch. You can leverage some of the different tools and mechanisms like control tower and landing zone accelerator. These are pieces that you've seen organizations adopt, right? And there's different versions of it that you can put into your own organization. And the reason there is you're using a repeated pattern so that you build off of some of the knowledge. And if you have to take it all the way a step back to get, the typical certification knowledge, then that's great, because then you understand the fundamentals, the basics that we're trying to get to. And then you can start to go on your own knowledge quest, as we like to call it here on the Safe Room Feature and Security Side Quest, because these are the quests of knowledge to help you understand everything piece by piece and help you to go from level 100 to 400. And why do you do that? Well, one, knowledge quests help you to build aura. And what is that aura? Well, today's aura is going to be on permission boundaries, for example, but it's also to say, hey, if I'm starting out as a L100, level 100 person, I'm an apprentice gatekeeper, going with today's theme. Well, how do I know where to go, what to do? What are the next steps? Well, I think part of the next steps is understanding, hey, what do we know about IAM roles? I think that's the important part. Hey, I'm level 100. I'm trying to understand these different pieces of the puzzle. We start out with identity. We're going to roles. Then we could go to something like, hey, what service control policies do we have? These are the questions that we ask, right? To get to the part of, I'm leveling up a little bit, but I still need to go the next step, one step further beyond. If you get that reference, 10 billion points to you. And also, wait, is some kind of unit test for permissions that I could use to confirm accessibility before I roll them out. Well, it's interesting because there's different mechanisms that you could piece together. There's IAM access analyze to identify different permissions and all those kind of things. But overarchingly, defining your code. If you're using, let's say, CDK, a CloudFormation, Terraform, there's different pieces of this you could piece together. Right? It's all part of that exploration. And I think part of that conversation from going from level 100 to, let's say, hey, I'm a little bit more experienced. I'm the wielder of conditions, is understanding, okay, what do I do from a policy standpoint? Do I know condition context keys. All right, what is this? This is part of that conversation. And if you start to look at all of this and you start to see policy structure and you start to see a little bit of code, not to threat. I know you start to get that build up, that feeling, especially as we're running out of time too. But what we're doing is taking it piece by piece. We're stepping through it so that when you go from that to, hey, when do we use IAM permission boundaries? This is an interesting conversation. I chose this article for a reason, right? If we take the step back and look at it, I call out the date on this. The date is 2022. And it's interesting because sometimes you may look for the latest articles. But what sometimes I suggest is look at some of the previous blog posts and articles. Why? Because you start to see how things are formed and how things are changed. How do you, say, go from that level 100 to 200? Well, it's understanding the fundamentals and why things were put into place a certain way. I think that's an interesting part of the conversation because part of, let's say, the scaling permission boundaries challenge can stem from understanding how do I enforce this across all my AWS accounts with different permissions and different people and different items. And the key to understanding that and going from 200 to the keeper of the rings, and by rings we mean the defensive rings, right? You see what we do here. But I think part of it is going to understanding something like the security reference architecture, because the SRA is put into place to say, hey, these are some of the fundamental items that we have observed and built for customers time and time again and modified and tweaked and said, hey, these are some of the fundamental structures to put into place. And hey, what are some IAM resources that we could take a look at from a service control policy, resource control policy, all these things in between. I think this is a good piece of the puzzle to dive into, right? So as we continue on, we start to think about, all right, these are the implementation patterns that we scale with, that we have to enforce. So first thing we do is go to chat, and I don't know if it fits, but could you create an instance and environment for a boundary that only has the least privileged info and you could have the user? So if there was a compromise, it will limit the blast radius. I don't know, maybe that's too much space. This is an interesting thought experiment, right? So if you have a boundary, right, ideally you want that boundary to apply to a role. And what we try to limit is a user, let's say an IAM user by itself. So what you always try to strive towards is short-term credentialed access. So how do we do that? Well, we have roles that somebody can assume for a limited period of time. And with that, that role has limited access, least privilege. And if they're leveraging, let's say, permission boundaries, that identity has that ceiling that can't exceed anything. So that would help to limit that blast radius. And also, that's part of some of the best practices for implementing and writing effective boundary permissions, right? Because the goal of this is how do we effectively write, right? How do we go through that route? Well, the goal of a well-crafted permission boundary and to be a keeper of the rings, right? We say control tower, we say all these things, but really what we're trying to get to, if we're trying to identify ourselves as the keeper of the rings of defense, is making sure that there's enough room to build your workloads while legitimately requiring the identity access that you need. And done. It's like, wait, can you repeat that? That's what we're essentially trying to do is, what are the workloads that you're trying to build within your accounts? And do you have the identity that matches what is trying to be built? That means you have different levels of environments, right? Best practices. Within those environments, let's say you are following control tower. You have experimental OU, and within that experimental OU, that's the sandbox environment. It's not connected to any of your network or anything along those lines. It's just for developers to play it. You have some base level SCPs and structures and boundaries, but that's where they test out the services. And then from there, you have your promotion process of, okay, I can start them out in developer and then a dev account. And then in a dev account, it goes into, let's say, UAT and then non-prod and then prod. Let's say something along those lines. And then you have that workflow, and then you can define those boundaries and keep going from there. Which boundaries? Well, all of them. From your SCPs, your outer structure, to your permission boundaries, which we're focusing on, and then continuing on from there. Right? And I say continue on from there because there's a long chart of identifying these different pieces. And then you start to get into understanding some of the, let's say, edge cases, right? And what those edge cases are, right? Like service link roles, cross-service dependencies, and so on and so forth. Wildcard permissions. Well, should you have wildcard permissions? I would say the majority of the time, no, because it's going against that least privilege, but there might be some cases for it. Some. But what you want to do is make sure that you implement items and boundaries that, one, don't prevent that acceleration too much, but it puts into place that ceiling. And that's where the SCPs and permission boundaries come into play. So having an SCP that denies, let's say, I am create and I am create user, unless it's approved by a permission boundary, that's attached at the highest level of enforcement. So you kind of see how I'm weaving all these together. And the best thing to think about when you're trying to structure all these different items is an onion. Simple, right? Onion has layers. If you get that reference, 10 billion points to you as well. And each one of those layers has a different component that you should be looking out for, that you should be monitoring, that you should be, let's say, revising over time as you continue to scale. And then from there, you continue to leverage different tools. And if you don't know what tools, come back every week, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, to figure out what tools we're discussing. Because it's a fun time over here at the Safe from Peace and Security Side Quest, because what we essentially help you to do is build up those experience points that we spoke about earlier. One piece at a time, one point at a time, one project at a time, till eventually you level up. You unlocked a new level comes up. And then eventually from there, you start to help your environment stay a little bit more secure, because security is the top priority, and that's where we like to stay. And no, thank you, Spider, for joining in, asking questions. And thank you, Lewis and Ari and everybody else, because it was another great show. And if I channel my inner Russ, the last thing we like to leave off on is build an incident response plan, because this is how you iterate. This is how you go through. Yes, and Jose. Thank you, Jose. Always thanks, Jose, for joining in today and joining back in next week as we continue to have this fun and continue to go down the path of discovery and side quests. So until next time, thank you. Goodbye. Have a great one.